by the end of this whole series.
Julie. Nice to meet you. Yeah, I work in the Polk Stormwater.
I want to welcome everybody today to, I think it's our fifth session, not counting the tour itself, of our Stormwater series. It's good to see so many people here today. Just for a little quick housekeeping in case you haven't been here, if you go out the doors behind you, take a right and another right, you'll find yourself to the restrooms. If you find that you are in need of some caffeine, if you go out, take a right and a left, there is a coffee place, but they're only open until 2:30, so you need to make that decision quickly if you're going to need that coffee. And we are also recording these sessions. You'll see there's a camera back there that as soon as I get done speaking, I'm going to run back there and take over. We're putting these out on a Google Drive, so the presentations as well as the speakings will be available to you. If for some reason you needed to return to something, share it with a colleague, or if there was a session previously that you weren't able to come to, it is out there. If you need an access link to that, simply let me know. I think I've probably provided it about half a dozen times, but I know it gets buried in email, so just let me know. So, if you've been following along on the topics list that we gave when we first kicked this whole thing off, you might notice that we're not talking today about what we thought we were going to talk about, because events conspired to lead us to think that perhaps a discussion around flooding and community resiliency would be in order given the floods that the metro area experienced a few weeks ago. So I especially want to thank our panelists for being here today on relatively short notice, as well as our presenters for later on. So thank you very much for your flexibility and willingness to participate. We're going to start off today with a panel discussion about the flooding that happened, resiliency, some of the decisions made, and some decisions that will be made going forward. And we have with us today representatives from city staff, elected officials, emergency management, and others. And we're going to invite everybody who's up here to speak for a little bit about their own experience in their community. But then we're going to open up to questions. And so we really want you to be thinking of questions that you want to know, things you want to ask. And I promise you, if you don't come up with them, then you have to listen to Pat ask the questions.
Isn't that so bad?
So, last thing for the panel and all the speakers, we've got a couple of handheld mics. This one is currently off, so you'll just flip on when it's your turn to speak. That way we can make sure we're picking up the audio for the recording.
So we apparently are going to try and avoid having me ask questions. So with that in mind, each one of our panel members will be making a short presentation before we get to the Q&A, so please take some notes about some of those questions you want to ask. And we have with us Justin Glisson, who's the state climatologist for the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, John Davis, who's the Deputy Director of the Polk County Emergency Management, my Mayor of Urbandale, Bob Andeweg, Jonathan Gano, Public Works Director, City of Des Moines, and John Swanson, who's Watershed Management Authority Coordinator, Polk Soil and Water Conservation District. And we're going to just take these folks in order of the agenda. So Justin, if you want to kick us off with a few comments related to climate.
So, as I'll show you in my presentation, but again, I'm Justin Glisson, State Climatologist of Iowa. So flooding and extreme events are things that I studied when I was in college. So I have a PhD in extreme events. So this is right down my alley. If you want to go to the next slide. So what I'm going to talk about today are precipitation trends, and specifically precipitation trends that we've seen in Polk County and central Iowa over the past 20 to 30 years. And there'll be some big words in here, but I'll explain those. So the first thing we'll talk about is gentle synoptic versus small scale. Now synoptic, I mean highs and lows that move across the state. So we can think of that as the state scale, whereas smaller events are the ones that happened on June 30th in Polk County. Second thing I'll talk about is the increase that we've seen in high intensity events. Now high intensity events are the thunderstorms that pop up and just rain out 2 or 3 inches. And we've had a lot of those this summer and into the spring also. And then I'll also talk about some trends that we see seasonally. We have spring rains, which are increasing. And these have effects on planting. They have effects on the growing season. So these are long-term events, or long-term behaviors that are impacted by the changes that we see in precipitation. And then finally, I'll talk about how summer behavior is changing. What we're seeing is summer rain is decreasing. What's happening is we're front-loading precipitation in the springtime, and then the summertime is effectively drying out. And this has an impact, especially in drought conditions. Hot summer conditions lead to livestock and crop stress, as we're seeing in southern Iowa, and also impacts the actual soil. So if we had an event in which the soil was really dry and really compact, so if we haven't had precipitation in a long time, we get a June 30th event happening, you're going to have a lot more flooding because that water's not able to soak in. So those are things we're going to talk about. Okay, go ahead. So precipitation, is there a slide before this one? Was there a slide? Yes. Oh, I just did that one. All right. Okay. I can't do 2 minutes though. Okay, so let's talk about precipitation extremes. A typical co-op station, so a typical weather station that the National Weather Service uses, typically will experience a 1 to 2 inch rainfall on a given day, 1 to 2 times a year. And this is what we've seen in the past. Over the last 2 decades, specifically the last 2 decades, and over the last 3 decades, we've seen the frequency, so the amount of days that we're seeing extreme events happen, and the intensity, so the amount of rainfall that we're seeing, both increasing. And these events have impacts on, obviously, urban and suburban flooding and stormwater management, but also agricultural runoff and soil loss, and then large-scale downstream flooding. So this is going to be hard to just look at, or at least the text, but this is Polk County, and this is the precipitation trend from 1989 to 2018. The big spikes are big events, the small spikes are small events or dry events, but the scale starts at 1 inch. What we're seeing in this trend over the last 30 years is that we're having an increase per decade of almost 1 inch of intensity in these extreme events. So what's happening is now we're getting where we usually would expect up to 2 inch rainfall events. Now we're getting up to 4 and 5 inch events. And this is the trend that's been happening over the last 20 years. Over the last 20 years, that was 30 years, over the last 20 years, we're actually about 1.57, so 1.5 inches more. So over the last 20 years, we've seen we're getting 5 to 6 inch rainfall events on a given day at co-op stations, and they're happening up to 3 to 4 times. So twice as much as we've seen in the long-term trend. And this is for Polk County, as I said, but this is pretty representative of central Iowa in the state as a whole. Whereas we're seeing in the southern parts of the state drying events that are occurring more often. So there's quite a dichotomy between parts of the state. And this is going to be hard to read too. These are multi-station extremes. So what this is showing you are extreme events that are occurring at a co-op station. And what I'm showing you here, the top event is a 5-inch rainfall. Now this is an average of all Polk County co-op stations. So what we're seeing, this top event here, 5.5 inches, that is the highest intensity event that we've seen in the observational record, and that's the June 30th event. This is an average again. We had co-op sites that hit up to 8 inches of rain, but what we're seeing is an increase in these events. So 13 and above are effectively 17 and above are 2-inch or greater rainfall events, which are extreme in terms of how we define an extreme event. All of these events, except 2, have occurred in the 1990s or the 2000s. And this is from the long-term record. So it's an obvious trend that we're seeing more precipitation events. And that's the top event. One more discussion on this. What we're seeing is we have these synoptic events that I was talking about, these gentle rainfall events that we would typically like to see for crop watering our lawns, so 2 to 3 hour gentle rainfall events. Those are diminishing greatly, and what we're seeing are these high intensity, short temporal span events that just pop up and rain out. Or what happens, as the Aiken event did, you have a surface front, surface warm front. This is 4 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 10 o'clock. You had a surface stationary boundary that had warm, moist air pumping in from the Gulf of Mexico. And that stationary boundary acts as a wall and a lifting mechanism. So all that precipitation, all the instability in the atmosphere started forcing thunderstorms in the afternoon. And if you click on that, link, this will show you the radar loop. Okay, so 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, we start to see these lines of thunderstorms pop up on the surface stationary front. Now what's happening is effectively blocking the flow to the east, so you have these pop-up storms on the warm front. They just pop up, rain out, and then behind them you get a new thunderstorm that pops up. So what was happening is Polk County was the central emphasis of this stationary front. And what we've seen over the past 20 years, especially in the summertime, spring to summertime, we're getting more stationary flow because the jet stream is further north. And when the jet stream's further north, the transient features that we would expect to bring gentle precipitation across Iowa, they're either too far north, so we know in May, June, and early July, this part of Iowa was in precipitation surplus of up to 10 inches. The southern part of the state, because the jet stream was so high up, or so far north, they're in 3-year deficits of almost 22 inches of rain. So there's a big spread across the state, and part of this is a function of the jet stream behavior. Also, and I'll close this out, also what we're seeing with a warmer atmosphere, you have the ability to have more water vapor held in the atmosphere. So when you get a forcing mechanism like a stationary front or a cold front that forces thunderstorms, they'll pop up and they'll rain out all that precipitate, all that rainfall potential in the atmosphere, and then they'll just regenerate. And that's what we saw in the Ankeny event. This is the accumulated precipitation, big bullseye on Polk County, locally up to 8 inches. And this is the radar indicated precipitation. There is a white pixel in there which indicates the radar picked up 10 inches of rainfall. The National Weather Service, within a 10-minute period that evening, had 1 inch of rain in 10 minutes. The infrastructure cannot support that. And that's all I have.
Well, that's stunning. So next on the agenda, we have John Davis, who witnessed all of this up close and personal as the Deputy Director of Polk County Emergency Management. John?
Thank you. So, yeah, it's been quite a July, right? Yay, August. I was so happy when the calendar changed last night. So sort of give you a background of where we started at. To be fair, I'm going to roll the clock back about 6 years or so. The Capital Crossroads project identified vegetative debris management as sort of a goal. We've always kind of struggled with what do we do after high wind events with downed trees and branches and those sorts of things. So starting with that project, we kind of embarked on a couple of year process with the public works folks to drag them kicking and screaming along with me on a journey that took them not only through debris management, vegetative debris management, but all of the other categories of debris and then damage assessment, because you really can't do debris management if you have no idea what's damaged, where, the extent, all those sorts of things. So we really focused over, like I said, about 1.5 years, probably 2 years on the damage assessment process, debris management, where are we going to take debris, what are the strategies for picking up debris after an event, whether that's a tornado, flood, or whatever. So we've had that plan in place. We did a lot of training on that. We've done some recurring training in years since then. So that kind of gets you set up for the June rain event. Some other things that were going on through that process that before we got the big 10-inch rain, we've been seeing some rises in Saylorville Reservoir that were cause for concern. And so probably 2, maybe 2.5 weeks before the June 30th rain event, we started looking at Saylorville Reservoir and started making some plans and contingencies should we experience that unrestricted flow from the reservoir. 2008, 2010, 93 kind of the type scenarios there. So we were already looking at that. The Corps of Engineers over the last several years has been looking at Saylorville Reservoir and the outflows from that. They've come to the conclusion, much like was just presented here, we were having more rain events, more runoff. And so the last couple of years, we've successfully lobbied the Corps of Engineers to allow us a temporary deviation to the outflow of Saylorville Reservoir. So what's that temporary deviation has done is allow additional outflows. It's removed some balancing restrictions between Saylorville and Red Rock that in the past they've tried to balance how much storage capacity there are in those two reservoirs. And what I wanted to point out with that is those two, Jonathan, it's been 2 or 3 years now we've done that temporary deviation, about 3 years. We saw direct benefits from that this year, that our June 30th Rainmaker event was not then compounded by Saylorville Reservoir going complete unrestricted flow over the spillway. So the Corps of Engineers is looking at a permanent amendment to their regulated flow plan that will basically mirror what we've asked for in that temporary deviation the last 3 years. So there are some public meetings. I'm sure some of the cities will be asked their input. Hey, are you seeing impacts from this, positive or negative, those sorts of things. But I just wanted to point that out. Please participate in that process because there are benefits to that we are seeing, especially in this June 30th event. The other thing that we're in the process of is our every 5-year review of our hazard mitigation plan. The timing of that was really pretty good, trying to get people interested in the great, exciting, thrilling, edge-of-your-seat discussion of hazard mitigation. And some of you just kind of like, when I said that, right? But there are direct benefits out of the hazard mitigation process. Property acquisitions, buyouts, those sorts of things. We can use FEMA funding in hazard mitigation to do those projects. And honestly, that key to that door is the hazard mitigation plan. So we would never be able to do property acquisitions and buyouts and those sorts of things if your communities aren't involved in that hazard mitigation process. So that kind of sets the stage for everything. The June 30th flood, I'm also a part-time police officer for the city of Des Moines, so I was lucky enough to be wearing a blue polyester suit and Kevlar, which is great for flash flooding. We were at Methodist Hospital and Children's ICU taking a report on a potential child abuse case when the storm actually really started up. So by the time I was completed with that report and we leave, I'm met by a security guard at Methodist Hospital who says, "You're not going anywhere." And I said, "What? We're leaving." Report's done. He says, "No, you can't leave physically. We're on an island right now." So those of you that are familiar with Methodist Hospital, sort of sits up on a hill. I stood next to my patrol car and did this. Oh yeah, we have a problem, right? So ambulances were actually pulling out of the ambulance bay, trying to find a way out and then turn around and pull back into the ambulance bay and just riding out the storm. Pretty rapidly, radio traffic was such that we were needed out on the street. We had to find a way to get out. I won't discuss publicly, especially while it's being recorded, how we did that, but we left Methodist Hospital and immediately started responding to people trapped in cars and rising water, evacuations of homes, businesses. It actually got to the point where all the Des Moines fire assets were tied up, and there were still calls for service holding. So law enforcement was actually responding to medical calls and those sorts of things. And what's going on? I have chest pains, we'll get in a car, let's go. And we were taking folks to the hospital and that sort of stuff. In the middle of that, of course, my phone is ringing from my boss, wanting to know when I'm going to show up at our emergency operations center to support the flood operations. I'll get there as soon as I can. You know, we're doing all these rescues and everything. Ended up about midnight or so, I was finally able to leave the police department in my still soaked uniform, my boots full of water, to go into the EOC and then start in, about 3 weeks of operations there. So the initial flood response, I think police, fire, EMS did a great job being able to respond to those things as quickly as they could with obviously limited resources. And the reason I say limited is just the call volume was so great in most of these cities that it taxed the system. Both the 911 systems were overloaded, as well as the actual responders, just not enough responders for the number of calls coming in. Starting that night and then early the next day, our focus was on just opening roads. People had gotten flooded out in cars and just got out and left. So we had abandoned cars and intersections all over the place. So just trying to get that roads back open to allow emergency response. Obviously we had some skilled care facilities that had evacuated, some apartment complexes on the east side of Des Moines that evacuated, so mass care and sheltering, the emergency shelter kind of things. And then really started into the process of, ironically, where we started 6 years ago, damage assessment and debris management. Learned some sort of important things out of that process with damage assessment. We had no formalized way of doing that. I mean, we knew how we were going to placard houses. We knew how we were going to report. We knew what the categories of damage needed to look like and all those sorts of things. We just didn't have a good mechanism to track all of that stuff, so it was being done on spreadsheets, which turned into a nightmare, because as soon as I share a spreadsheet with you, sorry to pick on you, he doesn't like the order that the spreadsheet's in, so he starts moving columns, and well, I want to add 3 things, and this column here I don't care about, so I'm going to take out your data integrity. That just goes out the window. So we started using a software that's available from Iowa Homeland Security and Emergency Management. It's web-based. The general public could go in on the website, put in their information. Hey, I had flooding in my house, a little description, address, phone number, those sorts of things, which really started to give us an idea of extent and geographical spread of this. River flooding, I'll probably get beat up on this, but is easy. I know where river flooding is going to occur. I know where the structures are going to be impacted. This was just, there was no rhyme or reason to it. It was literally everywhere, as the case is normally with flash flooding. So being able to identify where these structures were at, and then we could send out damage assessment teams to do a search of the home. I guess search probably is not a good word, an assessment of the home to make sure it was safe for people to inhabit, and those sorts of things. I think in the end, we ended up with about 6,200 structures that were reported to us that had some sort of flood impact, whether that was business or residential. I'm under no illusion that that's all of the structures that were probably impacted by flooding. I think we've thrown around the figure, we probably know of about 1/3. And that's just nothing more than an unscientific guess. Most people probably just cleaned up water that was in their house, called their insurance company if that was necessary, and moved on with life, which is fine. It's also fine that people called and reported to us. So I'm sure that we're underreported with those 6,200 structures in Polk County. I'm sure that number is much greater that actually had some amount of water damage in their homes. So sent out damage assessment teams. That allowed us to be able to start capturing, the rain barely had stopped and people started asking us, when's FEMA going to get here? As if they're a 911 agency that come lights and siren. That is a process to get them in. To this day, we still don't have FEMA here. That request has gone up and we've provided them the data, but the very first step in that is to do damage assessment and figure out how many structures, how many homes, and how many are insured, how many are underinsured, how many of that's their primary residence, how many is that a rental or a vacation home, all those sorts of things. So we got through the damage assessment process and then started in pretty rapidly on debris management. Luckily, this was not a big vegetative debris generating event. We didn't have a lot of trees down, branches down, those sorts of things, but it was just all the other stuff that immediately Sunday we started seeing show up on curbs of just piles of carpet and drywall and all the contents inside people's homes. So then becomes the nightmare of how do we manage that? I think we have a pretty good plan that lists out 5 different options for the communities to select from for their debris management process. The difficulty in that still, I think, is messaging. Okay, I live in this city and I'm watching the news. They're following this plan, but the city, maybe the other side of the street or 2 blocks down, is doing something else. I think all of those were really appropriate decisions. I was excited that nobody went completely off the plan and chose something that wasn't in the plan, but it just made public messaging sort of a nightmare for us of, okay, I live where, and what am I supposed to do, and who do I call, or do I need to call? You're just going to show up and haul the stuff off. So that was sort of the next wave, and then the wave that started after that I completely did not expect were thousands upon thousands of calls of people, hey, my basement is flooded and I need help. I need somebody to come pull the drywall out. I need somebody to do mold remediation. I need somebody to haul the water heater, the furnace, all those things out of the basement, boxes of stuff, furniture. So that has been an ongoing process right up until about a half hour before we started. That we're still trying to find volunteers for homes, people that are elderly, people with disabilities, people that don't have the income to be able to support cleanup on their own. We're still trying to source volunteers and special training groups to go into these folks' homes and clean things up. It is simply amazing to me that we're still getting calls 30 plus days after the event, and it's the first time we've ever heard from these folks. Hey, I've had this water in my basement since the storm. That's been a month ago, and I still have, it was 2 weeks ago, we were still finding people about a week and a half ago with raw sewage in their basements. So just amazing the scale, the scope of the problem out there, and then how do you manage hundreds upon hundreds of volunteers, some of them unaffiliated, some of them untrained, unskilled, not equipped, but willing to do good work. How do we then deploy those to help folks in their homes that still have needs? So I probably went way over my allotted time, but that sort of gives you the overall of what emergency management's been trying to do since the storm.
Mayor Andoin.
All right, thanks. And I also want to recognize I've got a fellow mayor here too, Dave Burgess, Dave, so chime in if you hear anything that I'm saying that doesn't sound right. But first of all, I want to say thank you for participating in this, because I've been involved on the Capital Crossroads from the beginning and been one of the tri-chairs of the government collaborative. So it's heartening to see this level of participation, to see it ongoing, to see that it's working, and that we're getting together and we're doing things right and trying to help each other move forward. So first of all, just a big thank you, because I'll probably have to report out in another month or so as far as what the progress has been, so I'll be glad to do that. So I don't know exactly what I can add other than just probably from an elected official's perspective on how to deal with crisis events, and this was certainly a crisis event. In my 12 plus years, I've unfortunately had to deal with a couple crisis events over the years, and I've learned from that. I've also learned that there's no exact playbook for everyone how you deal with it, but I think I can kind of break it down into some general parameters as far as how I view them and how I can respond as an elected official. But I guess the first one is, that night, I can remember exactly, actually I was at one of my council members' houses, it lives only a few blocks from where I am. We're having dinner and sitting in their dining room and having some nice conversation and listening to the rain outside. There's no window where we were, so I just couldn't really see and get any perspective on how hard this rain was coming down. But I said, boy, it sounds like a lot of rain. And pretty soon my phone starts blowing up with the aerial flood warnings. I said, I think we better wrap this up and and take assessment where we are. So, and actually, when I tried to get back down to my house, as I said, only a few blocks away, my own street was flooded, and there was already a car swept away on my own street, and I had to back around and come around I'm on a horseshoe type street, and I was able to come around the other way and come from a high point and get into my yard. But got home, turned on the TV, and was taking assessment. Saw my own fire chief on TV talking about the duplex that had exploded, and I said, well, this is bad. And so I guess at that point though, my first reaction was to get out there, and I need to be out there and helping, but that's the last thing I can do. So I've learned in the immediate point of the first response, stay the hell out of the way. I guess is my thought. I just said if I'm needed, they know how to get a hold of me. I had my phone by my side, and I was just watching and taking in the information and trying to figure out where we were, and making sure that our team had everything that they needed. But to stay back, and once the first response was over, I knew there was going to be work to do. So I stayed patient. We had the midnight conference call with Polk County Emergency Management. I hopped on that and listened to get the immediate assessment of where we were, and what was happening, and what we needed to respond to. I knew it was going to be a long day on that Sunday. Got up at first light, drove around Urbandale just to see the damage we had, what we were having to deal with. Went to both our fire stations and the police station to make sure our folks were safe, and they had everything they needed in the immediate time frame then. And so just tried to take first assessment at first light on that Sunday, and then by 10 o'clock, Polk County Emergency Management, which I think I've spent more time there in the last month than I have in the last 5 years, but it truly was critical that we do that, come together, and I think John summed it up pretty well. But I think really that process worked out pretty well. There are some things we can learn from that, but I think overall the process worked pretty well. But that Sunday morning, obviously we had the initial assessment. We had the Urbandale team down there that morning. Our fire chief and assistant fire chief were down there. My city manager was there. Our HR director was there. And that's when we first came up with the initial plan as far as how we're going to respond to the situation. And we got that was the nice thing, we could sit there and collaborate right there and come up with our initial plan. We did that. We laid it in place by Sunday at noon, how we were going to respond to the immediate aftermath of this, and because we knew we'd be getting calls for debris pickup. We knew we had a lot of flooding, just from what we could tell and from initial conversation. We didn't know exactly the extent of that, as John said, for probably a few days. And even then, we had I was amazed about the delay in some of the reporting from our residents as far as where we were, and some pockets of extreme damage that I was not initially aware of. And we found that out even 10 days or 2 weeks later, that we had some houses that had some extreme flooding, a small pocket on the southeast side of our city that I was not aware of. So, I think the next phase, as I said, is more coordination from an elected official perspective, making sure our staff has the resources they need, and that we're doing the right thing, getting the communication out to my council. I tried to deflect the information flow from our council because they're getting questions and calls from residents. They're trying to respond, so I try to manage that part of it, is communicating with the council, so we have a consistent message out to our residents, and then after that, it's just managing the problem from there. So I think it worked pretty well. I especially appreciated Polk County Emergency Management's involvement in the 211 process. I think, as John said, maybe something we can look at improving on is the consistent message from the region, and I understand that's sometimes difficult to do because we had different severities of issues in different cities, and we still have, even though we are a region, we still have different cities and different elected officials, and they choose to do things a little bit differently. But I think if anything we could work on, if we have a region-wide situation like this again, maybe we can collaborate a little bit better and talk a little bit more. And that comes on us as elected officials. I'm not saying that we make that message more consistent and have the response a little bit more consistent than what we had here. But I think even what we did here, I think it worked pretty well. 2-1 worked overall pretty well. The daily press conferences, we can push information out that way. I know a lot of people were getting information that way as well. So overall, I think I would grade us pretty well on the response, and a lot of it has to do with our staff and with you folks as far as doing the right thing. So thank you for everything you've done. We know this is an extreme event, and I think everybody stepped up to respond very well. So thank you from an elected official's perspective for what you've done. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mayor.
My experience was much like the mayor's on Saturday. I was decompressing from an 18-hour car drive. I just finished a week at the beach on vacation. Looked out my front window and saw the cul-de-sac filling up with water and thought, oh, I better go to work. So, as John said, traditional riverine flooding is a well-understood, well-documented experience. We've got literally a playbook. At this point, we do these actions. And when the river gets to this point, we do these actions. And the situation on Walnut Creek and 4 Mile Creek unfolded exactly like we thought it would, based on the forecasts that the National Weather Service was issuing for river flooding. Those, the asterisk moment came somewhere between 10 p.m. and midnight, when the forecast for 4 Mile Creek went from cresting at 14 and some change feet to 17, and we thought, oh crap, it's time to go do a little more work in that neighborhood. Complicating, fun factor folded into this experience, though the staff was able to adapt to the situation, is that we were coming into a holiday week. Common practice is to let as many people as you can go during that time, because it only takes 4 vacation days to get a whole week off. So I won't say we were half-staffed, but we had a significant number of people out of the office. And we realized that on Sunday morning, when my deputy director and I were beginning to work out the solid waste plan, we thought, well, we'll call the solid waste administrator, and, oh wait, no, he's on vacation. But we have his backup. No, she's on vacation too. So it was, we had the realization at that moment, this is kind of like a dress rehearsal for pandemic flu. Half your staff are dead, go, you still have a job to do. We're rehearsing for the zombie apocalypse. So we got to adjust a lot of things on the fly. The nice thing about having a playbook for traditional riverine flooding is that everyone is trained on everyone else's job, so we can accommodate vacancies pretty easily. It's just a matter of pulling in different people who may not be as well practiced at those particular things. The other fun detail about this is that aside from the operation of the flood control system, shutting gates and turning on pumps and setting other things, monitoring the levees and just watching what the water is going to do, a major part of our emergency response is barricading off roadways to keep people from driving into water. But because of the reservation of the Capitol complex and all of the barricading of all the streets and accesses there, and even into entire blocks were shut down into the East Village for Yankee Doodle Pops, every single barricade in our inventory was deployed to the Capitol for the event, which was later, so we ended up stealing our barricades back from the state, which I'm sure is poetic in some way, but we had to put them out for emergency response. We delivered them back when the flood waters receded. So a lot of work to do in watching what's the unfolding of what's very predictable. The wild card in this was what I've been describing as the freakishly large amount of rain that landed in the northwest corner of town, well away from the river. And there we had the most displeasure amongst our residents about the performance of storm sewers and capacities, immediately overwhelmed, and then putting water into places where it either hasn't been or there are known trouble spots that were even worse than they have traditionally been. That was the impact of flash flooding on neighborhoods was felt in a way that has not been felt before, and I think we saw the reason why from Justin's slide, when we're right at the very top of a long list of extreme events with an even more extreme event than history has provided so far. We're going to see things happen, put water in places that just haven't. So a historic level crest on 4 Mile Creek. Walnut Creek was fairly manageable from our perspective on our side of the creek, only because of previous mitigation efforts that bought out a lot of the houses that were in our side of the floodplain there. The levees in West Des Moines closed their side of the gates, and we just kind of watched the river come up and watch it go down on that side on Walnut Creek. And same with 4 Mile. There's not really much to do other than barricade it, keep people out, and try to send the fire department in with boats to get those who were stranded out of their homes. But the severity and intensity of the flash flooding inside established neighborhoods where you can go blocks without seeing a drainage channel. It's all underground, and all these pipes were built in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s, and they were done at a time when, as I was discussing with our city engineer, the practice of engineering must have been a much simpler undertaking, because traditional neighborhood design dictated where the streets would go, and where you see the grid imposed on a map is a surefire indicator of where you're going to have a flooding problem and a freakishly large rain event lands on it, because the grid does not follow the topography. You get a little further out in the metro area and you start to see roads curve, and I would tell our audience at neighborhood meetings, that's not because we like curvy streets. It's because that's where the land wants to put the street, because downhill is where the water wants to go, and you don't want to put your house down at the bottom of that. And it's a lot cheaper to leave that drainage way open and carrying a lot more capacity than it is to do what we've seen in many of the much older parts of the metro area, not just in Des Moines, but even in the first ring suburbs that were built in as the development pattern marched out. Anywhere you see the grid pattern, you can surefire see from old aerial photos a creek that runs diagonally through the grid, what's now the grid, where a pipe was just dropped in, street was paved on top, and houses were built right next to it. And that's exactly what happened on the edge of our city, 57th Street, 1 block away from Merle Hay and Urbandale, which has problems with capacity anyway. Only 20 acres upstream from that particular street, but a wall of water 6 feet deep came crashing in between houses, crossed the street, floated the asphalt of the street up enough to shove debris underneath it, and then it floated back down. Luckily it was new asphalt, so it was flexible and could ride up and back down without breaking. And then across the street, and it did trap a 2x4, some fence, an entire fence panel, paint bucket, and interestingly enough, a couch cushion. No kidding, the resident wanted the couch cushion back without any rips or tears in it because it was part of a match set. And this is one of the homes that have just had their basement wall cave in and lost everything in their basement, which I'm told included a very expensive baseball card collection. Maybe not a good place to store that. But it was important to her to get the couch cushion back. So we took the couch cushion out with hand tools and gave it back to her. She was very, very happy. But that's a textbook example of the problem of traditional neighborhood design without adequate consideration for stormwater. And as I tell people their question is, how could this happen? What can we do to make sure this never happens again? Well, this is like if you have a serious disease and you go to a doctor and they say they're going to cure you or no problem or anything, you may want to go get a second opinion. An engineer should not tell you that will never happen again, because we live in a world of probabilities, and I sure wouldn't bet my license on something never happening again. It might not, but chances are increasing that it will. We'll do what we can to solve the majority of the problems for most of the time, but the problem still may return. We just don't have the resources to build big enough pipes to handle all the water that might come, and even if we did, it would be a waste of those resources. So we're working with our neighborhoods to, one, manage their expectations, to do a reasonable amount of work in small watersheds. We know we have problems in little areas where I call them pockets of devastation, where 2, 3, 4, 5 houses are damaged or completely destroyed from the damage assessment process. That will guide our efforts to look at what we can do in those upstream areas to mitigate some of the effects. We'll be doing as much housing buyout in the coming months as the city of Des Moines has done in the last 20 years. budgeting, I think, $12 or $13 million to buy out the houses that are damaged, severely damaged, or reached the point of being destroyed, so that those people can proceed with confidence in advance of the 2 years or 3 year timeline for getting FEMA money for hazard mitigation, which would still only tackle a fraction of the list. But we know we have problems in these places, and that will guide our efforts to looking at stormwater projects inside of neighborhoods that will help alleviate those, mitigate those problems from coming back in the future.
Thank you.
And with that, I'll be providing the transition piece as we start talking about how can we look at upstream flood protection strategies to mitigate some of these problems from the upstream down.
Jonathan, make sure you tip that when you talk into it, not over it.
Yes. That much better. So I'm going to talk about some of the work we've been doing in the Fort Mock Creek watershed. Jonathan may speak up a little bit too from his perspective. We've been working together on this watershed. But again, this is one of the key ones that were impacted by our recent flood events. And as we've been talking about this watershed, about 2 years ago, this one map from our watershed management plan really spurred this conversation. This idea of upstream detention, investing upstream to hold water where it falls. Because at the end of the day, we've talked, a lot of communities have talked as part of their watershed management authorities, as part of their work on our watershed efforts. If you're at the downstream end of the funnel, you cannot fix the flooding issue. The City of Des Moines here in Fort Mock Creek cannot hold water back because they're already at the bottom of the funnel. The water is simply coming to them. There's a lot of communities that are already like that. So as we've, these watershed management authorities that have grown across the metro, one of the tasks that really it set the stage for is this idea of upstream investment, this idea of collaboratively working together to put practices, the upstream areas, to hold back water. So I'm going to go into a little bit of what we've learned, because we're coming up on 2 years now. We've been working on doing this exact thing, and we've learned a lot. I'd like to think that we spent those 2 years learning what works, what doesn't work, and really setting ourselves up for getting projects on the ground, holding back water. One of the first kind of opportunities that came up was this idea of wetlands. Now, there's a very successful state program called the Conservation Reserve Easement Program, the CREP Wetland Program. There's actually, as we sit today, almost a 5-year waiting list for farmers to get in on this program. And one of the reasons it's so successful, it provides a great funding source. They look at what does it really take to tie together the needs of a farmer with the needs of water quality. Now again, water quality is important, but that's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about flood control. Now as we saw this, we saw sites, could we tie together these water quality focused practices and add flood control benefits? And the answer is yes, and it's simply different design mechanisms. Some of those first sessions as part of the Stormwater series, they talked about designing not just for water quality, but the entire unified sizing criteria, from the small storm events to the large. And we looked at, let's use the same program, but let's tailor the design for additional flood control benefits. At the end of the day, there's federal funding available right now for these. The state has a waiting list. Could we replace the state side of this funding with local cities and counties? But then again, there's some things we're learning more about the CREP program. It's tailored for drainage areas between 500 and 4,000 acres. Hey, that's a pretty good size to also address flood control. But again, this is where learning curve comes in. In Iowa, the almost entire upstream portions of our watershed are privately owned. You're at the mercy of working with private landowners, farmers oftentimes, and these things take time to get to know them, and really you have to find out what is it going to take to sell practices to landowners. Here we had a project we worked for a few months on. We had one landowner completely on board, very excited about the project, but when we got the design put together, we needed about 20 acres of the neighbor's farm. And that neighbor, he simply said, hey, I've been farming this for 50 years, I'm going to farm until the day I die, you cannot pay me any amount of money for me to give it to you to build a wetland. And the truth is, that's just the reality of the situation, and the landowner to the south says, hey, I've known this guy my whole life, as soon as he passes away, I'm going to buy the farm and we're going to build this wetland. So again, it can be done, but it's not going to get done until you start those conversations. And again, you have to be very flexible with what practices you use, how are you selling these practices. But I would ask all of you, look at that program, look at how they're selling it. It's a great, very successful program here in the state. Traditional farm ponds. When we started talking with Des Moines and Polk County, we said, how are we going to sell these to farmers? When you talk to farmers, farm ponds is a great starting point. Is it going to hold back all the water we need it to? No, but it is one of the tools in the toolbox that can be used. And we actually have some farmers coming on board with this. Again, there's less storage with a farm pond, but it's a practice they're used to seeing on their landscape. They are cheaper. You can easily incorporate things like a lot of cities, they talk about bacteria, worried about cattle in the stream. That can be a win-win if you're willing to cost share on a pond. And again, I say cost share. That's something that's very new to cities as well. But that's a term in the agriculture area that's been used for the last 50 years. And this idea of cost sharing and basically splitting the cost to put a practice on the ground. So farm ponds were one of the tools that we're looking to incorporate. Again, it has its benefits, and it also has its cons. Wet regional detention. This was kind of the next step. These were sites we're looking at that were draining anywhere from 1 to 6 square miles, so much larger practices. And as we've looked at them, again, these were a practice we've been having some interest from landowners to sell. Again, if you're looking to install these on private lands, you're selling these. What is the tie to the local landowner? For these, lots of benefits. People love ponds, they love these bigger lakes. You have interest from the landowners. But also, when you're talking about larger ponds, small lakes, you have that opportunity for a public amenity. These would be future sites for parkland. They add water quality, they add habitat for fish, for birds. So wet detention, we've seen interest from this. And the key is we're not just talking about flood control when we're talking about wet detention. We gain interest through other avenues. But a big question to ask with this is, at what point is private ownership too much? At what point is it too much to handle? And a big part of that conversation is from the sediment that's going to flow into these larger structures. So from day one, we've said we need to have sediment forebays at the heads of these structures, and we do not want to rely on private landowners to remove that sediment long term. So again, through our partnership, we've looked at someone taking ownership of the sediment forebay, because these are supposed to provide benefits downstream for years to come. If you're relying on a private landowner to clean that sediment out, you're kind of setting yourself up for loss. Another thing to think about if you're looking at investing upstream in wet detention, stream mitigation. That's going to come up day one. If you're putting streams underwater, you're going to have to mitigate those somewhere else. More to talk about that. We have been excited that at the same time, a lot of our cities, WMAs, we have large stream stabilization projects going on. We're doing these, you've probably heard us talk about oxbow restorations. These are actually these are projects that could be used to basically cover your stream mitigation. It's a conversation that can be had. But again, stream mitigation can be very expensive. It's something you're going to want to address early on in the permitting process. And at the end of the day, these wet regional detentions, even though they're quite large, in comparison to dry detention, they have relatively low storage capacity. So this is actually a site we're looking at in Formock Creek. This pond is going to provide us about 50 acre-foot of storage in a 100-year storm event. Similar dry basin, also in Formock Creek, similar drainage area, close to 200 acre-foot of storage. So again, but you don't get those benefits. This will never be a public amenity. This will not really provide water quality or habitat benefits. This is a designed flood control practice that's going to be put on the ground for flood control. Wetlands, ponds, wet detention, you get added benefits, you get that salesmanship. We've had the conversations, no private landowner is ever going to want to own one of these. So you have different selling points of getting these on the ground. One is we've used things such as, this site specifically, we're working with developers. If you allow us to give us the land to build this structure, you can utilize it for your immediate detention requirements. And that's not saying that everyone upstream can use it, because this is added storage. We're not building these in lieu of everyone upstream building structures. Everyone upstream will still build their structures. This is added storage. And again, sediment forebay. Large drainage areas, no matter what you do, you're going to have sediment moving into the system, keeping that functionality long term. And then I'll add just a couple final thoughts, because again, this is something we put a lot of time into. And again, we're almost 2 years in, we haven't built one yet, because it all comes back to that watershed story. We're working with people, we were just getting started in the watershed. We started in Formal Creek, we didn't know a single landowner in that watershed. So it takes a learning curve. But again, the salesmanship of the practice sites, once you have a site that works, you have to reach out to the landowner and find out what's going to sell to them. Is it public need? Is it visibility? Is it simply money? Are we simply going to have to buy the land? Public versus private ownership. Are there interested parties out there to own this and dedicate it to a park? County conservation boards, counties. Those are all things that can be discovered. Opportunity-based versus defined plan. Now, like I said, this all started back from that watershed management plan where they simply said, upstream regional detention is a good idea. This is your goal of upstream storage, 600 acre feet in Formal Creek. From our plan, they did not have defined locations. They didn't have exact spots on the map. They had, we gave you enough information to get started, and you're going to hear from some people coming next about starting with a very defined plan with locations figured out. Personally, I see some great benefits to having a defined plan to target locations where you're going to have the most benefits. But again, there's a learning curve in every watershed. At the end of the day, you can scare landowners off by putting a point on a map that's right on their field. So you have to use that information very sensitively. And lastly, it sounds corny, but partnership's key. These watershed management authorities, we're doing a lot of different things, but to me, the biggest thing we're doing is we're providing the location to have that conversation. Because all these structures we're talking about in Formal Creek, we are having at least 3 to 4 funding partners. Someone's going to take ownership of it. In many cases, cities, it may not look the best for them to simply pay to build a pond on someone's property, but it's different to provide cost share through the Stormwater Conservation District, something we've been doing for decades, working through our maintenance agreements. Again, each partner can bring a different role to the table. And what we're doing in Formal will not work exactly the same in Walnut or Beaver or Mudcamp Spring, but you have to find like-minded people to kind of pull the ideas together. So with that, I think that'll end my spiel.
Let me ask just a couple of questions to get the party started. And again, I hope you've taken some notes because we really want to get to your questions. But this first one takes us back to Justin for just a moment because Jonathan referred to a freakishly large amount of rain. And so my question for you, Justin, is 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line, are we going to look at this as a freakishly large amount of rain? What's happening as far as you're concerned, future projections?
So, yes, it was a freakish, I can't say it. A lot of rain. We can go by the trends. So, again, the conditions that were set up, and this event's going to be studied for years. I studied extreme events when I was at Iowa State. What we try to do is take the science from these type of events and then build them into our forecast models. Forecast model's not going to get this. It's very isolated, very restrictive grid size. The city, the county. 10, 20 years from now, that's still going to be a lot of rain. This was the top event that Polk County's ever had in the observational record, 1895. One site had an upwards of 8 inches of rain. Radar indicated some sites had 10 inches or more. We don't know. But the rainfall estimates, they were pulling trees down, which I've never seen before. And what happens when you get in a situation like this where you have storms that pop up and train, you also have severe thunderstorms associated with those. You have hail that's also melting, so you get these big drops of water. And you get localized, extremely torrential downpours that can do damage themselves. So long story short, the trends show us that the extreme events are going to get more extreme and the isolated events are becoming more frequent.
So even though this will still be a large amount of rain down the line, we will be seeing this stuff with more frequency, the greater intensity, more frequently, more often. So we need to be prepared for it.
Definitely.
Okay, so from a resilience standpoint, what should we be doing? And I'm going to ask you guys to address this first regionally. what should we be doing, not just in response, but in better preparation, again, not for the response, but for mitigating the immediate impacts of those kinds of rainfalls. Jonathan talked about particular places for buyout. What can we do on a regional basis? What are policy pieces that we need to be putting in place? What should we be thinking about?
These two. No, both of you. Jonathan and the mayor, yeah.
Okay, now it's on. I'll offer a couple things that would have benefited the city of Des Moines during this event. As Mr. Swanson said, it's long established that the best way to handle a drop of rain is to accommodate it where it lands. So those activities that we can encourage in upstream either communities or way outside of our communities will help with what we experienced in Walnut Creek and 4 Mile Creek. Now down at our end of the area, we can continue working on the planning efforts that have already been underway. A great way to make a residential neighborhood that's in a floodplain is more resilient is buy out the houses and retire the infrastructure and get people out, because a floodplain is a bad place to live, just generally speaking. So what we can do there to accelerate those activities, and even with this large infusion from this event, we will still not be able to clean out the entire 4 Mile Creek corridor, though the cooperative plan between the City of Des Moines Parks Department and Polk County Conservation Board for what will happen to the future of the 4 Mile area, the entire lower 4 miles programmed as a to turn that from a liability into an asset, as a recreational feature, to embrace the creek, and that is where the water is supposed to go, and make it so that the water can go there without harming our community or our infrastructure. In the cases of individual neighborhoods experiencing torrential downpours, again, one of the best ways to make the community more resilient is to begin retrofitting our communities to make them more capable of handling very large inundations of water. If this is to become more frequent and more intense, as our trends have suggested, then we ought not just go, oh, we made it through that one, won't have to do that for another 50 years. But begin working in small bites, in small watersheds. A good way is to start at the top of the watershed and just work your way down. Or you can conversely start at the bottom and work your way up with capacity improvements on the disconnecting from downstream concept. Those things can alleviate the need for downstream capacity improvements. So working at the top of the watershed with enhancing the ability of that watershed to retain water that lands there can be helpful, while also working from the bottom up to give the water that does land a way to get out without causing damage.
Mayor, do you have anything to add to that? Or?
Well, again, just from my perspective, I think what we can do is encourage. First of all, talking about retrofitting, we identified east of 86th Street. That was probably where we had the most flooding, which is not surprising since that was built. It's the oldest part of our city. We have retrofitted some of our storm sewers through there, and I shudder to think what kind of flooding we would have had in some areas that we hadn't retrofitted before. Even we had some problems where we had increase in storm sewer size, but we still had some flooding issues there, and it could have been a lot worse than what we had. But we still need to continue to work on that. We're identifying pockets. We are using our stormwater fund to encourage private investment and partnerships with residents, where we have grants that we offer that we can do some mitigation with residents, and looking as we develop, encouraging development that's going to be overall better as far as our future, as far as where we sit, as far as mitigating as much as we can in the future. So I think we need to. I think our staff's looking at that, but we need to encourage developers and develop those policies that will encourage development that will be less intense intensive on stormwater than it has been.
What questions do you folks have for our panel here? Matt?
You want me to do it on mic or no?
You're right here.
Okay, close enough. I have a few questions for some of the panelists. Justin, I know you mentioned the jet stream behavior. But what's contributing to that for the reason the jet stream is so much further north than it has been? And is that something that is going to continue every season, or is it something that is, was an anomaly for this year?
Why is the jet stream further north?
Good question. Let me frame it this way. May was the warmest May on record. June was the 10th warmest on record. April was the coldest April on record. This year's been very odd, and we can point to larger scale, what we call teleconnections, and you've heard of El Nino. El Nino and La Nina, El Nino is a warm sea surface anomaly in the Pacific. La Nina is a cold sea surface anomaly in the Pacific, same region. Those affect the convection across the Pacific basin. So when you have convection on one side of the basin versus another, it affects the jet stream across the United States. We're in a La Nina, a weak La Nina going into a neutral phase of ENSO, which we know the jet stream behavior for El Nino pretty well. We know the jet stream behavior for La Nina pretty well because we have analog years in which those events have occurred. In neutral years, which we're in right now, neutral condition, our forecast models are, some of them are trash. So you'll look at 2-week outlooks, 3-week outlooks, monthly outlooks, seasonal outlooks, and across the Midwest, it's equal chance above or below precipitation, above or below temperature extremes. Large-scale mechanisms affect large-scale mechanisms. So the jet stream is a large-scale mechanism that draws highs and lows across the United States, west and east. With that jet stream so far north, over in May and June, where it should be in August, July, August, you get a stagnant condition in which you have these stationary fronts or cold fronts set up, and they just sit over the same area. And with the jet stream so far north, you get the moisture gate open from the Gulf. You get so much precipitation potential in the atmosphere that effectively if a storm pops up, it's going to draw out all that moisture and rain it down on someplace. And that place happened on June 30th. So to answer your question, we don't know exactly why the jet stream is where it is right now, because we don't have an analog in which that can tell us that this behavior should be happening. One thing that can be happening is we get these blocking highs in the Pacific, and when you have a block in the Pacific, it forces the jet stream further forward, but we usually don't see that for weeks on end. This also gets into heat waves. When that jet stream's so far north, you get thermal domes that set up over Iowa, as we saw in May and June, and some of July. What we're seeing is that these things are increasing, and the jet stream is becoming increasingly a factor because in the summertime, and I could go on for 5 hours, so I'll end it. The atmosphere is warming up. Seasonally, it's warming up. Annually, it's warming up. The jet stream is driven by temperature gradients between the mid-latitudes and the poles. With a relaxed temperature gradient, it affects the behavior of the jet stream. So that's what we're going with.
I had just a couple more. John, from emergency management's perspective, this was kind of a different event, as you alluded to. We're used to river flooding. This was a little bit different. What's the biggest kind of lesson that you and AJ and the folks have talked about from this experience on June 30 and July 1? Just in terms of your operations and experience versus, the river flooding, which we're all kind of used to.
Sure. So some of the complicating factors there with river flooding, or for example, a tornado, sorry, Mondrian, we can deploy assets, damage assessment teams, whatever, to a neighborhood start them at one end of the neighborhood and walk to the other end to do damage assessment, to do debris management, to do those sorts of things. Where this being so widespread across the county, it was more of a shotgun approach, and we really needed the citizens' input to tell us where the damages were, where people had water in their basements, as opposed to just being able to send, traditional damage assessment teams, drop them off and tell them, walk a quarter mile and do all your damage assessment there. So that really complicated things for us. Increasingly, we're seeing the need for GIS and IT support in our EOC that we've never seen before. To be able to do mapping to tell us where is the event, what is its geographical extent, severity, all of those kinds of things. That has created some growing pains for both us and the GIS folks, mainly because the GIS IT folks are not trained, not experienced, probably is a better word, in working in a high pressure environment in an emergency operations center where I need you to produce something now, right? And they like to make maps that look pretty, and I understand that, and I appreciate pretty maps, but sometimes you just need something right now, right? It's good enough, let's just go with it. So there definitely was some growing pains on both sides of that for us that we're going to continue to work through. And then I am not a GIS guru by any stretch of the imagination, but understanding all of the different map sets and all of the different ways that you can get information, all of the different layers, and this one's better for this reason than that one, and all of that. So at some point we're going to have to try and sit down and understand in a disaster environment what do we need and what's the appropriate way to use that information.
Thanks, John. My last question is for the mayor. From elected officials' perspective, having gone through this kind of experience, what's been your reflection on it a month later as you think about, policy or, discussions with your fellow city council members? Give me kind of the elected official perspective kind of a month later. It's a big question, I know.
Thanks, yeah.
I know. You're gonna thank me for that later, I'm sure.
Yeah, thanks, I appreciate that. Again, I think it's just going to, how do we deal with this going forward? And, from what I'm hearing, this may be the new normal. So we've seen some more extreme events, and hopefully, we certainly have some time to reflect on it and move forward. But I think it's not business as usual. I think we really need to get serious about how we address stormwater in our development, and both in new development and also looking at our existing infrastructure and where we are. And again, we have done some of that, but I think it's something that really we need to pay very serious attention to, and how we deal with it, not just city by city, but working together as a region. Because we can do things in Urbandale, or you can do things in Clive, but unless, as we talk about, unless you deal with the whole watershed, you're really not going to address fully the situation. So let's look at it. Let's have a new mentality individually as cities and counties and regions, but also let's work together and how we address the watershed as a whole and keep that communication going. And this is obviously a good response to that right now.
So here's a quick follow-up to that, and I'm not picking on you, but I know you gotta go. And because of your role in Capital Crossroads, what would be the function of a group like this, folks who've been meeting together for a few months and doing some education on green infrastructure and stormwater? What might we be able to do to support you in your leadership role at Capital Crossroads in working toward more regional solutions?
I think, again, getting that consistent message back out to our individual cities and who you work for, and saying and somehow convening a regional solution, a regional discussion on this. So I think don't just leave here today and say, okay, we're done with that, let's put that on the shelf and we're done. And I say, this is an ongoing conversation, and we need to be serious about it. And it's something that we need to address regionally, and we need to have some, it'll probably be at times difficult conversations, but let's have them, and let's keep moving forward on it.
We have time for probably one or two more quick questions before our panelists got to split. Yes, Jim?
I've got an observation as well, maybe a question of some of the other communities, but in Johnston, over the past 5 or 6 years, we have done several stormwater litigation projects. And actually, those of you that went on the bus tour a month ago, or a few weeks ago, I guess over a month ago, you observed one of them that we had. But one thing that I noticed, all of those held up. I mean, we had went in there and did some construction. We filled back banks to give opportunities for the water to flow properly through those areas, and even some structures that were put in. And anyway, so we also put some structures in. The good news is that they held up. So we didn't have any issues where we need to go back now and correct those. The bad news is there was too much water. They did overtop, and I mean, we would expect that with this storm event. We had 8 inches of rain in Johnston. But I also attended the WRA board meeting last month, and they were talking about 4 Mile Creek because they had done some mitigation up in 4 Mile Creek. And my understanding is that held up too with the rain event. And so what that tells me is that where we're going and what we've been talking about through this series of conversations is these work. I mean, I have a lot of confidence that in regular rain events, our mitigation efforts are going to work as they were designed. Certainly they're not designed for an event like we experienced, but I feel good about where we've invested our funds and the fact that this wasn't a total washout. They held up from the construction that we have done, and it gives me a lot of confidence that that's going to happen. And my question is, from other communities, did you guys have the same observations, or did we have areas where we have some concerns after this event with some of the improvements we've done in our stormwater areas?
Since I'm the only one with the microphone, I'll go ahead and answer that question. No, I'll second your observation that places where we have done work to modern standards was able to withstand the torrential deluge. Stream bank stabilizations in 4 Mile Creek did exactly what they were supposed to, even to the point where we'll be able to see progress from the natural deposition of materials on a bank that had been eroding because of work done in the creek. So not only did we do the right thing, but the thing is working the way, not only did it withstand the flood flow, but it is performing as a bioengineered solution the way that it's supposed to. So that's very, very, very good to see validated our assumptions going into it. Where we saw stormwater failures was almost exclusively in what we might call ancient infrastructure, stuff that's been around for 50, 60, 70, 80 years, that kind of work where it just simply wasn't able to accommodate. And the modern design standards lead us to construction that can handle the kind of forces that these stormwaters would put on it, whereas we saw evidence in our system across the city that wasn't the case with older stuff.
For Clive, it was a similar experience. A lot of our stream bank stabilization projects held up. One recent one that we just completed had to get a little work redone to it, but similar experience to the other 2 communities.
Probably hadn't had much time to establish itself fully. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
One for Justin real quick.
Question for Justin.
Do you see the rains that we've had now becoming the norm, and we need to be planning for heavier rains in future years?
You might repeat the question.
So the rainfall that we're seeing over the past, let's say 10 years, rainfall behavior, is this going to be the new norm going into the future? Well, trends suggest yes. The trends also suggest, as I mentioned in the presentation, that we're getting isolated high-intensity events more frequently than we have in the past, and the nice gentle rains that we've had in the past are kind of going by the wayside. The erratic behavior, it might wash out in trends in 50 years, but the trends from the past 20, 30, 40 years point to this is a new normal.
Well, I'd like to give a big round of applause to our panelists. The Mayor Englewood had to get to Waukee by 3 p.m., so he had to head out. We'll give them a round of applause and then a 5-minute, and I mean 5-minute stretch We don't want to miss fire engineering. We'll take a little bit more of a break after that presentation. So 5-minute stretch, first round of applause. Thank you very much.
Strategies and the case studies that go with that. So we are glad this afternoon to have fire engineering here. They're going to talk about some of the case studies and some of the projects that they've done in mitigation to some flooding. So I'm going to turn it over to their team, and maybe you can introduce yourselves individually, and we'll go from there.
Yep. Thank you, Jennifer. So we are with Fire Engineering, and we were asked to come here today to talk about some case studies from some very specific projects just west of the Missouri River. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about ourselves, but I do want to introduce our team here. We've got Lindy Rogers and Bob Gregalunas, both owners at Fire Engineering. We were founded in 2012 when Bob, Lindy, and Mike, who some of you know and have met, decided to go out and be entrepreneurial and start their own firm, so that's what they've done. And 6 years later, it's going very well, and we opened our Des Moines office about 15 months ago. And we are focused exclusively on water resource projects. We don't do any other type of engineering other than some disciplines to support our water projects. So today, I want to talk just really briefly about the recent flooding. We've talked a lot about that, but then we're going to launch right into our case studies. So, and there's some controversy about this quote as to whether or not Ben Franklin really said it, but allegedly, Ben Franklin is credited with saying, "In wine there is wisdom, in beer there is freedom, and in water there is bacteria." Now, normally I would use this at a water quality presentation, but because of the issues of the day, I'm going to just butcher his quote and say, "In wine there is wisdom, in beer there is freedom, and in Des Moines there's often just too much water." So, Justin did a great job of talking about the historical context of the June 30th events. And so what we did was we looked at Beaver Creek, Walnut Creek, and 4 Mile Creek, the most downstream USGS gauging stations. And we just reported here the top 5 daily mean flows of all 3 of those tributaries. And what you'll notice is Beaver Creek, the July 30th, or June 30th, July 1st event was the 16th highest mean daily flow at that gauging station, going back to about 2004, so not quite 15 years worth of data. Conversely, at Walnut Creek, it was the 3rd highest mean daily flow, and at 4 Mile Creek, it was the highest daily flow by quite a margin. So what you're seeing there, obviously, is the differences in localized precipitation, and also, in this case, that lack of a backwater effect with those larger regional floods on the Des Moines and the Raccoon Rivers. So we just wanted to point that out, and we'll be talking primarily about similar events in our case studies, although those larger regional floods do enter into some of our case studies as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lindy.
I'm going to talk about one of our case studies in a little city called Deschler, Nebraska. So Deschler, Nebraska saw a major flood event in 2015. It was the 100-year flood. And again, in 2016, they got a 100-year flood. So they were very distressed by the damages it caused to their city. And like Jonathan mentioned, they wanted to know how do they ever prevent this from ever happening again. So they did have a part of a multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plan. So they were involved with that, which gave them the road to go to FEMA for some funding to do a study. And so they ended up getting a hazard mitigation grant to do lot level mitigation analysis in their city. So the lot level mitigation grant covered basically analyzing each parcel for what they could do to mitigate flood damages. It included public meetings and involvement, risk analysis, and the development of mitigation alternatives. What it did not include was refined H&H models or an analysis of watershed level mitigations. So when we went to the city and did our first public meeting with them, it became very clear that they weren't really on board with what their mitigation grant was providing to them. We soon learned about an upstream dam that had been studied back in the 80s that they were very interested in and thought would be the savior to their city. We also learned that there are several roadway crossing structures that had been replaced in the past 10 years that they were also sure was causing part of their problem. So after we left this meeting, we kind of had to come back, relook at our scope, and figure out how are we going to give them the answers they need and still fall within the grant. So the very first thing we did, we kind of moved our money around. We decided that we were going to end up doing some detailed H&H to kind of give them the answers they needed to show them exactly why the flooding would happen. So we developed a rough HEC HMS model. And then we looked at the flood, some NextRad data from the 2 flood events in 2015 and 2016, so we could kind of talk to them about why it happened. So if you look, they both have a lot of pink in them, which is a high event. It's like an 8 to 10 inch of rain. But it's a little bit more widespread in the 2015 event, which is on your left, and then the 2016 event on your right. So basically what this kind of told us is that there are 2 creeks. So Snake Creek ran through the city of Deschler. Spring Creek had a confluence with Snake Creek out on the outskirts of the city. So if you look at the 2015 event, they had a lot of rain over both of these creek areas. But on the 2016 event, they had higher rainfall on Snake Creek and not as much on Spring Creek. So it wasn't as concentrated over the whole entire Spring Creek area. What we did then is we created a HEC-RAS model and took the NextRad data and kind of ran it through our HEC-RAS model to kind of give them an idea of what was actually happening with each event. So here's a video that kind of shows you the 2016 HEC-RAS model that we developed. It shows the water coming into the city. What's it supposed to?
Bob might have to start it for you.
You started?
Just did.
Okay.
At least I think we did. Let's give that one more click.
Not going? There it goes.
There.
So obviously this is an elapsed time. So it shows them the 2016 event. We also did one for them to show them the 2015 event. What this ended up showing them was that the 2015 event was primarily caused by backwater on Spring Creek, that Snake Creek, so Snake Creek could not put their outflows into Spring Creek because it was already at a high event. Then it showed them in 2016, they just had higher flows on Snake Creek and Spring Creek wasn't as high. But it's 2 completely different scenarios that happened, but both gave them what they thought was a 100-year flood event, and they thought it was the same event. But it's important to be able to explain that to the townspeople as you're talking to them about what mitigation would really work for them. So the next thing we did after we did our HEC-RAS model is we actually had really good data in this city, which is important. We had a video on one of the streets that showed the flood coming in and flood coming out. So we were actually able to calibrate one of our models exactly to the video. If this one shows. So if you look, the water's coming down the main street to the south on the right-hand side, and the other one's looking to the north, so they're opposite. But you can see, you want to run that one more time? But you can kind of see where the peaks at the exact moment. So the water shows up to the image on the left and the right at the same time. But what this did is this was able to give them validity to our model. So when we showed these to them in slower motion and showed them, hey, this model matches this model matches the video you had, and then also talk to townspeople and say, where did you experience the flooding at? Well, in this event, I saw it at my sidewalk. In this event, I saw it up the street. You kind of create a little bit of truth in your model, well, a lot of truth in your model, and the townspeople became a little bit more trusting of what we were telling them, which is important because a lot of times people hear about these models, but they're not always as accurate as they should be. So what do these refined models tell us? Basically, when we use these refined models, we also looked at the upstream dam they had all talked about and told them when we put the upstream dam in, it showed that it provided no relief to their city. There were little pockets that were relieved when that dam was put in upstream, but because of the backwater effect of Spring Creek, they weren't going to get any relief with an upstream storage structure. It also showed them that the improvements to the roadway structures were not their problem because the water was the backwater coming in caused a lot of their flooding. It also told them about the huge role that the backwater in Spring Creek played. And it truth checked what property owners had already seen. So that was very important. And then it also gave us the information that we needed to be able to accurately determine lot level mitigation measures for each individual parcel. So the final project deliverable is what we are in the process of delivering to them right now is we're giving them parcel level reports So every parcel that was inside of the study, it's about 46 parcels, we give them elevation data, we give them data of the different storm events where the water's going to be sitting within their lot, and then we tell them what we think the best method of mitigation is. And then there's a cost-benefit analysis on each one of those as well. So as they go through this, some of them, obviously people aren't going to be super happy when they see buyouts as the option. They look for other methods. But when you have those models to back truth, they become a little bit more understanding of the methods you're telling them that are going to help fix it. So this was able to also prioritize methods in their hazard mitigation plan. So they now have a list of, hey, as dollars come in, let's do this one first, this one next. And it also provides an evacuation plan. There was 2 critical care facilities in this area that basically became islands like the hospital John had talked about. And people were not able to leave or enter during the facility or during the flood event. So what we did with these models is we're able to show them, hey, if you do this here, this will stop the water there. This can get you an actual evacuation route if you need that to happen. One thing I do want to say real quick is that we were able to do all of that within our original scope and fee for the hazard mitigation. As many of you know who work for FEMA, the funds are very dedicated to specific tasks. So we were able to just add some more to a different task than have to get additional funds. So the next one real quick is completely the opposite event that you guys have had. This is about a city that had floodplain mapping extents that were increased. So basically, the city of Blair, Nebraska had a 78 flood insurance study. In 95, the firm maps came out for that. Then in 2006, they updated the study. And in 2012, they saw completely new floodplain limits that they hadn't seen in the past. So if you look, the light blue is the 2012 limits, and the 95 is the dark blue line. So if you look at this area, I can't go this far. The area to the south shows a lot of increased houses that were put in to the floodplain, and this kind of happened throughout their entire city. So like I said, this is almost the exact opposite of what you guys had. But I just wanted to talk about it quickly because of the models and being able to truth check what people actually see with models. So they actually came to us at the beginning of this project and wanted us to do a feasibility on a detention structure upstream of the city to bring everybody back into the original limits. So the feasibility study was really rough, and all we did was a basic subtraction of discharge numbers from 1995 to 2012, and then determined if we could hold that volume somewhere. And we showed them that we could, and that it would probably be about a $3 million structure if they wanted to go that route. They decided they did want to go that route, so they kicked us off on doing a hazard mitigation grant for them to help get funding for that detention structure. And in the middle of that, what we found is that as we recreated the HEC-RAS model, there was not a digital copy of the HEC-RAS model available, so we had to recreate their hard copy of it. And when we projected this on new LiDAR contours, and when we refined our HEC-RAS models, that the numbers became completely different and the floodplain extents actually didn't match what they were showing on the maps. So if you look here, if you look on that map, you see that some of the areas saw an 89% reduction in discharge by just using more refined methods. So the scope of the project changed. What the city then wanted us to do is to go and do a LOMAR, which is basically a letter of map revision for them, and do all the new models, update them. We ended up doing surveying all the structures throughout the city and updated the HEC-RAS model with that, and then created the new floodplain extents and submitted that to FEMA for approval. And we just had our 90-day review time finished last week, so the maps are now official. And with this, we were able to, Okay, so we were able to remove a lot of structures out of the floodplain with this. So basically, we were able to remove from 213 to 165, so 48 parcels came out of the floodplain. 33 of those did not have structures, and then the 95 of them that still do have structures are outside the floodplain extents. So basically, the parcel touches the floodplain, the structure doesn't. And then the rest of them, all except 2, should be able to get elevation certificates to remove them from the floodplain permanently, or remove them from the requirements of flood insurance. So again, The results of this are the exact opposite of what you guys are looking at, but it's the importance of having models that tell the truth. When we came to these people who still are in the floodplain or people who still need to maintain flood insurance, when we showed them the depths that we were showing on their parcels, they were much more understanding of purchasing flood insurance for those depth amounts than the previous 10, 12 feet that they were being shown in before. They had never seen events like that, and so they had a huge problem paying the rates associated with them. So I'm going to pass it off to Bob right now.
Thank you. Well, so at this point in time, hopefully it's clear that best available information is not always good, unfortunately. And keeping along that theme, we'll discuss a little bit about Omaha. Now, Papillion Creek itself is approximately 400 square miles. It drains essentially all of Omaha metro area, and that's the area highlighted in yellow. I hope that's clear. Now, again, it's going to be very similar to what you find in Des Moines. We developed at the downstream end of the watershed, as John said. We developed at the end of the funnel. And now as development is progressing, it's working upstream, and all we're doing is passing more flood water off downstream. That's a problem. Now, interestingly enough, we had two major flood events, 1964 and 1965. Those flood events spurred a major study by the Corps of Engineers that came out in 1967 that identified 21 locations for regional detention cells, large dams, 500-year protection. At this point in time, well, let me back up. As of 2004, 7 of those had been built. Now, as we move up to 2008, I don't know how that's a decade ago already, but let's stay with it here. So as of 2008, FEMA decided that maps needed updated. Corps of Engineers got involved, our local natural resource district got involved, and they started on that path to update these maps. That was underway for 9 years, as all of us remember the wonderful FEMA process. And so fast forward to 2017, well, a lot changed. In that 9 years, we had 2 major regional detention cells built. We had 2 more under design by our firm, and actually they're about to be built right now. Obviously, NOAA Atlas 14 rainfall depths came out. The interesting mess of the Atlas 14 temporal distributions came out, and we're not even going to go into those right now. We also have better data, better rainfall data, better gauge data. USGS got involved on gauges, and so there's a lot of improvements, but as you would expect, major rainfall events happen, and they just always do. And the first question that everybody asks after a major rainfall event is, well, you got a rainfall runoff model, what did that say it should have been, versus what did we see? And so that's one of the tasks that we were asked to look at. Now, again, we're 10 years in at this point, and we were given 3 months to redo hydrology, hydraulics, inundation mapping, incorporate all the new reservoirs, all the rainfall analysis. But in normal flavor, we recognize right away that we're doing this with Atlas 2 hydrology. We're talking SCS type 2 distributions from, somebody help me out, 1962? Is that about right? We're dealing with very old data here. And so we have a lot of updates that need to go in. So the first thing we did was we actually worked on the temporal distributions. Now, temporal distribution is essentially how quick does that rainfall come down during a storm event. Now, we identified right away with help of our meteorologist sub-consultant that there's really 3 different types of storms that occur. I'm not going to get into a lot of details, but basically what we find is that with this dashed line here in the center, this is the old Atlas 2 distribution, type 2, it's very steep. And how steep that curve is basically the overall intensity of the rainfall event. Now what we find, we've got several different iterations, but this red line here on the far left, that's the winner. And that is what we feel, and the meteorologist feels, is the most appropriate temporal distribution for our area. Now what you notice is, that line is nowhere near as steep. That means that rainfall, after 50 plus years of updates, is coming down slower than we thought back in the 60s. That's very important. Now the next is an areal reduction factor. Now as thunderstorms increase in size spatially, that thunderstorm cannot produce as much rain. It just can't. And so from a 10 square mile watershed out to a 100 square mile watershed, we expect less rain for the same recurrence interval. So a 100-year storm has less depth associated with it. Now the old data flatlined out here at about 93%. So we had a whole 7% reduction with that. What we found in this area after updating everything was we were looking at reductions up to 32% for some of the watersheds. And that's a major change, and that just means that there's not as much moisture in this area of the country as they originally thought back when these curves were developed years ago. Now, what does that mean? We need to update hydrology. There were major storm events, as I said. This is something that we're going to find over and over again. It isn't that anything is wrong. All it is we have better data. And so what's happened is this was a calibrated output from one of the models. These are hard to see, I apologize, but dark black line here, that is what was observed. This bright orange line, if I put that rainfall event through the model, the way it was already calibrated, we're off by 100% on discharge. Volume is off by 60%. So the predictive model that should have been able to take this thunderstorm and run with it, it can't do it correctly. Now, we provided updates to the entirety of the 400 square miles, and of course we've got much better fitting curves now. So, we put everything together. We've got new aerial reduction factors, we've got new temporal distributions. We've raised rainfall rates up tremendously because of Atlas 14. We have new dams that have been placed inside the watershed. Put it all together, shake it, what do we get? 15 to 30% reductions within the watershed is what we end up with. Now, this matches very well to what our risk and understanding is over the last 50 plus years. So it does match more in line with what the client expects. Now, again, we're in a situation where there are a lot of utilities across this. So what does it mean at the end of the day? Actually, I'll go back here real quick. Now, this region here is a leveed stretch of the creek that runs through Papillion, Nebraska. This was a levee constructed in the 90s, 100-year levee, or at least it was supposed to be. Fast forward from the 90s to 2008, and they thought this levee was deficient by between 2 and 4 feet. Once we were done with the analysis, updated everything, provided calibrations, got approved by FEMA, this existing levee system was essentially able to be certified as is. No modifications really needed. So originally $23 million project to get this levee back up to specifications. We're down about $2 million right now as far as what those costs are. Now, the other added benefit to this is that, I don't know how it is in every community, but a lot of communities have freeboard requirements between your low steel on a bridge and your 100-year water surface elevation. Omaha's no different. We require about a foot. Well, there are several of these road crossings that it was infeasible to ever put a new bridge in because you had to have 1 foot of clearance, of course, and so we're talking a 6-foot increase. This one project allowed for all of these structures to go back on a replaceable list, and so now they are able to be modified, able to be replaced, at a lot less cost. Now, the other thing that this opens up for us with better quality information, better calibration, is new funding opportunities. Now, Nebraska has WSF, which is a Water Sustainability Fund, and I don't expect you to be familiar with it, but relatively new funding avenue. And so through detailed hydrology and hydraulics, again, highly detailed modeling output, we're able to show what, at essentially a 10-meter grid spacing, what type of damage estimates are we talking about. So when we went forward with our new reservoirs, WB6 and 7, we're actually able to compute very effectively and provide a very robust justification for the economics associated with those dams. And because of that, we were able to secure quite a bit of funding for the construction of those projects. Every community is complete once they get a plan. And so this is the Papio Partnership Plan. Now, as you would expect, we have water quality improvements. We want to capture the first ½ inch. We want peak flow reductions. Ideally, they were hoping that every subdivision would capture the 100-year. It turned out to be infeasible. A residential development capturing a 100-year difference between existing and future, aside from the fact that it's a really good structure, it's a maintenance nightmare. And because of that, the cities didn't want to take on these structures. The NRD didn't want to take on the structures. They were hard to maintain. There were too many of them. So they defaulted back and said, okay, the new developments, let's just go with the 2 and 10, and let's control those. This is manageable. The structure's not very big. Maintenance costs should be minimal. And that's where they're moving right now, and I think that works best for them. But the problem with that is now somebody still needs to control the 100-year. And the Papio NRD is in the course of basically implementing all the rest of those structures that the Corps identified in the 60s. So they've constructed another 5 structures since 2004, or I should say 3, and we'll get another 2 more. But they have 6 more on the books. And these are major regional structures. 500-year level of protection. Well, it was 500 years. Now it's about 400 because of Atlas 14, but we'll go to that some other day. Now, the other thing that comes up from this is that preservation, restoration, conservation. These are setbacks from the stream. This is a big lesson learned. They started with 3 to 1 plus 20. So if you picture the stream channel, take the toe inside the channel, 3 to 1 slope up, offset out 20 foot, Don't put any utilities any closer than that. Well, controlling the existing discharge and not letting that go up didn't fix a thing. These stream channels still degraded, and there was nothing we could do about it. I think that's one of the biggest lessons learned, is that you may have controlled what you think was the increase due to man's development, but the reality is these basins, these waterways are degrading whether we like it or not. And there's various reasons for that, but at the end of the day, they've come to realize these setbacks aren't sufficient. They're revising these right now. And if you have any questions on how they're doing it, let me know. I'll be happy. I could probably fill a 2-hour discussion about that. Let's see, that's probably not that important. That's probably enough on this. And so, moving into Wahoo Creek, now this is pretty applicable also. This is a 90 square mile watershed. It's almost all agriculture right now. And because of that, they have different flooding problems than Omaha does. It is still a funnel. It's an incredibly flat area once you get down to this region. Very flat. Once the water gets there, it's there for days. And there's not a lot we can do about that. When we're looking at this study, the NRD approached us and said, well, we'd like to look at 2 structures, 2 flood control structures. Can you help us? Absolutely. We started identifying 2, and there's an old plan from NRCS that had at least a dozen more. But of course, the question always comes to cost. Who pays for these things? I'd like to say that we had a money printer, but what we found, though, was that with these basins, because it's in predominantly agricultural settings, NRCS has tons of funds available. And as it worked out this particular calendar cycle, our CPP funds paid about $1.3 million. WSF, again, that's state of Nebraska only, they pitched about 1.1. WFPO, which is another NRCS fund, was able to contribute $11.3 million. So once we were able to apply for all of this funding, what started as 2 dam sites moved to 10. And we were actually able to look at implementing the bulk of their control structures way ahead of schedule. This means that the local sponsor pays $543,000 out of about $14 million. Wonderful project, very successful funding pursuits, very happy with this. And so we go into these structures, and of course we're looking at the best available information, which is really old. So obviously we're updating it. New HMS models, 2D HEC-RAS models. And what we need to do is optimize their locations. There are tons of utilities. This is in the middle of a farm field, but there's pipelines all over the place. And you have this, we have railroad crossings, which are affected by, of course, dam breach limits. So there are various problems that we run into that have to be planned around. Each one of the various constrictions have to be factored in while we do this. And what that means is at the end of the day, we refine this down to a list of exact locations that are implementable. And these are the locations identified here. These are identified way ahead of time. And if you have any questions about how these are implemented, let me know, because the NRDs are very different than, of course, the way that it's handled within the state of Iowa. And so while the NRD is isolating these exact locations, that doesn't always mean that the landowner is going to be willing, but at the end of the day, they're still going to get built. These are also structures that are going to control approximately a 25-year event. And so in these areas, that's what's economical. That's what makes sense from a benefit-cost standpoint. Most of your ag damages occur between the 5 and the 25-year event. 100 years meaningful, but not here. So when we're trying to isolate what really makes sense, that's where we're going. These are boring, we're not going to go there, but we've isolated, obviously, 10 locations that make the most sense right up front, exact locations that have the optimal benefit-cost relationship with the lowest risk threshold. And then, of course, there's also alternate sites should something else come up down the line that prevents these sites from being constructed. Now, with that, now John obviously mentioned that we can do wet detention. Excellent idea, wonderful way to do it. Dry detention is also possible. These are options that we've looked at in this watershed. And this is kind of a mix right in between. Now, this is still wet detention, but it's port riser. And so what that means is our flood pool is nowhere near as large. This makes it a lot better and a lot more appealing to farmers who now only have a flood easement on the majority of their property, where before they had flood water. So in these cases, they may get some flood damages in a bad year, a 10-year, 15-year event, but under most years, they're not going to have those damages. And again, moving in, dry dams are also an option. As John pointed out, they are problematic from the standpoint of sediment management. You're losing storage every year unless you put that in as part of the maintenance package as far as maintaining those. Got to move that material somewhere. Economics are probably the most important thing for watershed studies. You know, funding is always the problem. And where does the money come from? How quickly does it come in? And how do we capitalize on it? Knowing the funding sources has helped us tremendously in the state of Nebraska. We've been able to isolate funds that weren't really ideally meant for it, such as RCPP, where we're now using those for essentially detention structures. When it comes to the economics, we're able to come up with exact benefit cost numbers, and with detailed modeling, we have a very defensible product that's easy to hand off to the agency doing the review. They know it's technically sound, and it's a lot easier to approve than just some scratch on the back of your envelope. And again, I just wanted to point out that with these, again, actually, sorry about that. All right, I guess that's it for Wahoo.
I was about ready to give you that update.
Well, that's good. I was sensing you getting up, so.
So just a summary here of lessons learned. We've tried to connect the dots here with what you have experienced here locally in Des Moines, not just recently, but over the last 5 or 10 years or so. Obviously, we believe that understanding site-specific data, localized precipitation versus and flash flooding versus backwater impacts is critical to developing effective solutions. Upstream storage, while it's not always the answer when it does work, it's often the most cost-effective just in terms of benefits and cost and benefits of flood reduction. Site-specific storm analysis, this relates to what Bob talked about specifically with the Papio. That is often very useful, and again, understanding the sensitivity to the issue of the day here very much being flooding and not making our floodplain smaller. At the same time, it is important that the premiums and things associated with insurance is commensurate with the risks. So that's where that's very helpful. And then finally, these H&A's models often pay for themselves several times over when it comes to identifying cost-effective solutions, going out and attracting funds. So I think that's all we have for you today. We'd be happy to take some questions. I should have maybe mentioned this before we got started, but does everybody know what an NRD is? We use that a number of times. Natural Resource District cover the state of Nebraska. I believe there's 24 NRDs in the state of Nebraska. They are watershed-based entities, much like Iowa's recent development of WMAs, but they were developed back in the 70s. They have definitely a different status legislatively and from a funding standpoint. So if you look forward to the future with these WMAs, maybe 40 years, it could be one model of such a system. So that's what funded the Papio project and a number of others, Wahoo Creek as well. And the city of Deshler. If you have any more questions about those entities, just aside from the presentation, please let us know. We'd be happy to talk more about how those groups function.
Could you touch on real quick what led to the changes in the stream buffer requirements in the Omaha area at 3:1+20? What were you seeing with the streams?
That's a really, really good question. And I think the most recent example of that is the city of Gretna. They have literally a sanitary sewer line that parallels a creek corridor that they have moved 3 times. And it's because in these particular soils, and again, Omaha has, of course, different geologic soils, 400 square miles, things change. And we're getting into highly erosive soils now, where maybe we were in a little bit more stable soils when these rules were conceived. So we're talking about stream degradation 20 feet in areas, where we've actually had channels lowered 20 feet. Once that happens, those banks pull out and they can migrate by 40 to 50 feet each direction. And so that's actually what's triggering it right now anyway. It's mostly the utilities. But of course that degradation occurs and we're wiping out bridge foundations. We've got problems with well, just about everything, as you can imagine.
And developers developing up to that exact line, you know, like
Good point.
they're trying to get subdivisions in at the exact 20-foot point, you know, using the center line of the channel as their setback area instead of the size of the channel and stuff like that.
Because before it was 20 foot from the center line of the channel. Now
It was not defined well. That was not the intent.
Yep.
But because it wasn't defined as well.
3:1+20.
Yes.
And on top of that, we deal with, of course, survey age, because the game that's been played is, well, we have survey data that's 10 years old when this plat was originally conceived. We're going to go ahead and use that to do the 3:1+20. And, well, the stream's degraded 5 foot and migrated 40 feet in that time, but thanks for trying.
What other questions do we have?
How is the Blair, Nebraska flood insurance mapping project funded?
So originally, it was, when they wanted to do the detention structure, they were trying to get a hazard mitigation grant. But we came back and told them that we can just do the remapping for, I think it was like $50,000. So they funded it on their own.
Okay.
And they're actually paying for elevation certificates as well for anybody who wants to take them up on that.
And in this case, I think Blair is kind of unique because I don't want us to seem as the types that are trying to lower floodplain elevations because they go in either way. It doesn't really matter. These are just the ones that we thought were interesting. But with Blair, it is a highly incised channel with incredible channel capacity. And all the time, they've never seen the flow out of its banks ever. And I think before the original flood mapping, the 10-year, they were trying to show was breaking out. So this is probably an extreme side of that, where it's just bad modeling techniques or inconsistent modeling techniques led to poor information. And from a floodplain manager's perspective, or anybody here who is dealing with emergency management, you want to know where it floods and why. And I think that that's one of the bigger frustrations that Blair ran into is they're doing planning for flooding that they now know is never going to occur, at least not at this frequent a threshold.
All right, any others? Well, let's thank them very much.
Can we take, I'm going to go ahead and report out, and the reason we're grabbing the microphone is Erin's going to tape, report out portions of this, because I think it'll be interesting to folks. So we'll do the two policy folks first, followed by education, technical issues, and funding. So policy table 1, who's reporting out? Jim?
All right, so starting with this. So one of the things we talked about high on the list here is what we've been talking about is we can't do this within our city boundaries, that we need to get outside of that jurisdictional area and look at it as a watershed and how the policy interacts there. We talked about, consistently implementing consistent policies across that wider area, whatever we decide it would be also key and important. And we really talked, in thinking back on the different sessions we've been to, that really there's a lot of education needed. I mean, we've been doing a lot of education here and talking about a lot of different things, but we realize how little a lot of people know and understand on the issues. So whether it be the elected officials who keep rotating and we have to keep educating, or the public, or both, or all, to understand the issues and be able to either demand or talk or change those policies because everyone has that understanding of it. Policies on how to handle stormwater maybe not as well understood, or maybe not as well written down as they should be, depending on what thing we're talking about. And also just not sure if what we're doing is correct. So we're putting forth things that are new and we're building very quickly, and if we're doing that wrong and don't have the policies right there and need to make changes, we probably need to make them sooner versus later, and hopefully on that bigger scale. And then we talked quite a bit about the floodplain development type policy piece and how hard that can be with all the things that are in the floodplain already and all the business and the taxable income that's in that. And I think the last one I had was maybe more collaboration, just in general across. Did I miss anything? Okay.
And I think one of the things we're hearing from this table over here is similar in that the more collaboration and the consistency of the policy, but also it's the consistency of its implementation across the different municipalities. Who's reporting out here? Jen?
Yeah, so we heard we spoke about several similar things. First thing I brought up was consistency across a regional area. Really coming out that policy is that key to the long-term change. This change isn't going to happen just because it's the right thing to do. It's not going to just change itself. The policy is kind of that guiding force, but just getting the policy put in is kind of a step, but then longer term enforcing that policy and enforcing it day in and day out, educating the city council from staff. They're going to have to continually educate why this is important. It's not important just because it's green and it's good. It's important because this impacts your residents and this impacts your city. And they have to see the need for it, not just because it's it's a good thing to do. And then also touching on stream buffers, mapping, getting that conversation earlier, protecting residents from the streams themselves.
Great, so that was kind of in response to a question about what would be sort of a priority policy piece, and you guys thought about the buffers as a possibility. I think that'll come up again. Let's move over here to the education table, because we've already heard about some decision makers that need some level of education. I think you guys might have been talking about that, I'm not sure. Who, you?
Sure. Came up with quite a list, some things that have also been said, so I will try not to repeat. First would be, for education, cognizance of utilizing the education forums that may already exist within your city and consistently bringing this discussion about stormwater, floodwater, and other water issues into those spaces. So we also talk about the strategy because it is such a huge issue that affects many, many different parts of your city or your other government entity. The possibility of creating a dedicated campaign or a dedicated education series that brings in those different departments so that they can talk about what their touch is with the water that runs through the city. We talked about making sure that with all the different communication strategies that are present in your city that you use for community education and engaging stakeholders, the importance of making sure you layer those so that you create multiple touches across different platforms, and then also the importance of making sure that when you do have an opportunity to do something really rich, like the video that was shown with actual water rushing up a street, and pairing that then with what an inundation map looks like, that can really open up the minds of those people that you're trying to educate. So keeping it rich is important. Keeping your materials updated. The City of Des Moines made a great point that this event really became an opportunity for them to go through and make sure that their mitigation plan, their flood plan, all of the related pieces were most up to date, and really highlighting some of those best practices that can in the future help better manage an event like what we went through earlier this summer. Knowing key audiences came up. We specifically talked about developers, and were reminded of how clever it seemed like our friends from Minnesota who were talking about the St. Croix, that calculator they put together for their development community to pretty simply put in some inputs, and on the backside then see what they were going to be able to achieve in terms of water quality improvements. Our discussion here is a little bit different, but a calculator like that can create an audience that maybe is not as receptive as students and make them a little better students, we thought. We also started talking about pairing with other key data sets like a property values report. I know in Clive we've been able to do that, and how that discussion then becomes something that's valuable for thinking about our stormwater discussion as well.
I think that was really a great piece of work for 10 minutes. It sounded like a pretty thoughtful education plan. I'd give them a round of applause for that one. All right, good job. And so our technical issues team, what did you guys come up with, and who's reporting out?
I think in general we felt that it's obvious from all these discussions that there is a lot of good technical information out there available to us. Iowa Stormwater Management Manual, stream buffer ordinances, and all that, those lessons learned that we can have available to us. That it's just more a matter of trying to get those implemented through policies and ordinances and other methods. We also talked about need to keep those data sets out there, those design guidances updated, and as we talked about today about trends in climate and making sure that those are always considered forward. And then also talked about there's a lot of information out there that probably a lot of us didn't know was out there, and trying to make sure that data that's out there, those sources that are being provided to those of our staff that really need those.
So a couple of key technical pieces, but mainly it's really about getting a hold of the right data, getting it to the right people, and managing it properly so that the technical choices are made correctly. Is that fair enough? All right, and finally we've got our funding table. Are you reporting out for us? Great.
So the key item that was discussed at this table was understanding what funding mechanisms were available. They mentioned that some cities seem to be very proactive about going after funding for their projects. Other cities had no idea what type of avenue to go to get that. So maybe being a little bit more collaborative so that everybody, especially part of this group, understands what mechanisms are available. Another item was the costs that are associated with funding. So there's a lot of upfront planning. There's costs associated with keeping your mitigation plan updated, with doing, if you're looking for 319 funds, you have to have a 9-element plan in place, those kind of things. So those upfront costs that you have to incur in order to be able to even get in the door for the funding, and then not always having a direct line for the funding even if you do that work. Another item that was brought up was a lot of the funding seems to want to be used for shovel-ready projects, and that by that time, you're already so far down the road, it's almost like a last chance effort to go after the funding, and you just want to go on with the project and just kind of ignore that phase of it. And then they said that the funding seems to be, the funding needs seem to be usually reactive and not proactive. So if there's more funding on the planning part of it or the upfront, instead of after issues happen and looking for funds to remediate items that have occurred or events that have occurred. Did I miss anything? Okay.
Great job. Give yourselves a big round of applause. Good job, everybody. We have one more little exercise we'd like you to discuss, and we'll do the report outs on that. And because of the interest of time, since we want to get everybody out of here by 4 o'clock, you don't have to be overly structured with this conversation. We won't move on to the resilience piece on the last page. We're just going to run out of time. But what we would like to have you do is have a conversation based on these lessons learned. Discuss the changes you'd like to make in how your community or organization is addressing stormwater management. And try to get a little bit of a list there going. What would you like to see happen differently within your community or organization? Then the next part of this was, what would your table like to see the Des Moines metro region do differently? And again, prepare a list. You can kind of talk about those things almost simultaneously, I think. So go ahead and just kick around the conversation of what should we be doing differently, either at the local level and or at the metro or region-wide level, to start to make a real positive difference in how we're addressing flooding and water quality, overall stormwater management in central Iowa. So just go ahead and get started with that kind of a conversation, and make sure you get at least 5 bullets down somewhere. You got room for 10, let's get at least 5 down. It's 3:36 because we need to have people hear from each other on this. You got about another 10 to 12 minutes for this conversation. I'll probably call it at about 10 minutes. So, go. All right, let's report out. I think we've got some really good thoughts around the different tables here, and want to make sure that those of you who are recording actually get some of the notes down, because I'd like to get those sheets of paper from you. Somebody who had to leave earlier was kind of requesting, gee, can we see the results of these tabletop conversations? So we'll want to try and do some level of summary, if at all possible. I'm not volunteering for that, by the way, I'm just mentioning it. Somebody wants that to happen. All right, so this table right here, what did you come up with in terms of things you'd like to do either locally or regionally to improve the situation? Mr. McMillan, you want to report out?
Yeah. I think one of the big things is we talked about it would be ideal for the region to have a shared goal or mindset on these, but knowing that that is politically hard to do and not likely to happen very quickly in the short term, communities still have to figure out something to do themselves. And one regional approach that we talked about is, at least between the downstream and upstream communities, can we have some kind of agreement on, at critical points where a Walnut Creek or a 4 Mile Creek or whatever it may be comes from one community to the next, can we have an agreement on, here's how much CFS will allow to the downstream community versus the upstream community, and have some agreement on that so the downstream community can plan for that. So, for example, in Clive, we're at the bottom of the hill. If I know that the CFS from Walnut Creek or North Walnut Creek is going to, the communities agree to a certain amount at certain cross points, then I know what to plan for. And then the community upstream can use whatever tactics that they want to use
to get that CFS number where it needs to be, I don't care, as long as we're in agreement on that. And if they exceed that and that's measured, then there's a penalty, a financial penalty to the upstream community. Because if we're doing a buyout program at the bottom of the hill and that buyout program isn't big enough, then now we've got another issue, and then there's damages. And so, to me, that is, if we can't get to a goal statement with all the elected officials in agreement on in the region, can we at least come to some agreement between communities within watersheds? And this is really a watershed approach that won't be a surprise to anybody in this room. But, I mean, that's something tactical that can be done in the short term. I'm not saying it's going to be easy to come to those agreements, and there's a lot of science that would have to be done to figure that out. But at least it's a place to start. And that's a little bit of what we talked about.
Just a quick question, do we know if anybody's done that anywhere?
I'll defer to Doug on this one. Do you know? Do we know?
Clive and West Des Moines have
Yeah, we have a few.
a type of agreement related to the amount of discharge that's permitted through storm sewer.
We're currently under contract with HR Green doing a study to try to, we know that there's some places where we don't meet that criteria, and we're trying to work towards a solution. I think you reached out to Tom, and Tom and I just haven't had a chance to sit down, but I think Jeff and I were just talking how we want to get something together, and then, you know, if we can find grants and work collectively on a grant, we'll have a better shot of getting a grant or getting funding as two cities trying to solve a problem rather than us competing against each other to get something going. So
And that's a great example of, in that scenario, and this is University Avenue, there's drainage from West Des Moines that comes into Clive that eventually makes its way to Walnut Creek. Well, West Des Moines can determine in that scenario that it's going to be harder for us to retain some of that water in our areas just because of the natural drainage, and we're exceeding an agreement. Well, then there might be a partnership where West Des Moines and Clive work together to say, okay, in some of the drainage areas on the Clive side, maybe it makes sense to us to invest together. They meet the requirements of the agreement. We get some improvements that we can work together on to leverage our resources and maybe find a grant, which I'm sure many funding agencies would love on a collaborative project like that. Those are some of the creativities that at a local level we can work on now before a regional goal is determined. These are things we can work on together now.
Awesome.
Thank you for that.
That was great. All right, we'll go to you guys next. Who's reporting on here?
We did get off topic a little bit in our group, but we had some great conversations. A couple of changes, just kind of go over some of the stuff we talked about. Developing stormwater management plans for communities is kind of the necessary starting point for everyone to understand where they're at this point in time, moving forward, what needs to be done. And a key to that is information that can be used to support staff in their conversations with their council. Again, why is this important? Making sure that they have the tools that are needed to have those conversations and express that need. Grant opportunities. City staffs are busy. Are there resources out there? Possibly the stormwater conservation districts to hear about those goals and grant opportunities, and then tie it to the grants that we're constantly going after, and tying those two needs together.
Okay. Very good. This was a rich conversation that these tables were having. What do you got for me over here?
So our minds started leaping to bigger solutions, which was fun, but we had a couple of things that were more tactical and things that might be a little closer to being able to implement now. In the immediate aftermath of these events, knowledge of where your micro hotspots are. So we learned a little few of those when they're in sort of the east side of the metro. Des Moines talked about that a little bit. Urbandale talked about that. I know in Clive, where I am, we've learned quite a bit more about some of our unique hotspots as well. Documenting that, adjusting your plans so that you can better respond the next time something happens there, and can come up with mitigation strategies potentially as they present themselves now in the short term. Bigger options that we ended up talking about, funding is where we started. Funding is probably where this whole conversation ends as well. That is the lock that we can't seem to pick quite yet. But some of the things we talked about would be, like our friends in Nebraska, pretty awesome that their watershed equivalent entity has a dedicated funding source. Imagine that.
And that creates all kinds of interesting opportunities to create credit systems or a mitigation bank system, things that could create upstream and downstream collaborations to come up with what's going to be an appropriate watershed solution for some of these big water events and water quality questions as well. The other things we talked about would be whether it's a set of recommendations or possibly something that is a common set ordinance model, something that creates more consistency about how we present best practices and then how we actually codify them if we ever were to reach that approach across the entire region. The benefit then is predictability for all of the folks who are developing across the region. There is good consistency then in best practice sharing among all the municipalities that are partnering with all of those developers as they're being implemented as well. And it also creates some opportunities for us to present sort of the justification, the fact that these are the types of practices when they're done that can increase property values, and we can point to data across the metro then that backs that up. Right now I know in some municipalities we can show that from good relationship, the virtuous relationship between good stormwater practices and property values for both the building and the land. But it would be great to have that kind of data that we could use across all communities to really make the case and bring all of our other stakeholders along with us.
Outstanding, okay. And you guys had some really interesting, I think, kind of granular in a very positive way, ideas related to maintenance and other things.
I guess I'll start just by seconding some of the things we've heard before, and just consistency, whether it's an ordinance or a policy that relates to how we're going to govern or implement policies and best management practices. And it really seems like there's a disconnect in, we treat this development this way and this one this way. If we had a way to govern that through an ordinance, it just seems like it streamlines the process. And so that's just a repeat. The educational component also came up, and how do we get engagement, whether it's through council or leadership or city managers, to understand how critical this is to infrastructure and how we treat stormwater. And then also just there's this disconnect there with maintenance and how important that is. If we do a native seeding and we don't maintain it properly, we end up going and redoing it 3 years later. And so there's a cost to the taxpayers for that. And so having those policies or those SOPs clearly articulated to public works staff so that they can properly maintain those native areas is pretty important.
Yeah, that was a really good point that I think some of us weren't even thinking about. That's an education component of real note, yeah. And bring her home, Jennifer.
Okay, we had a couple different kind of themes go on in some of the talking that we were doing. We really looked at, well, one, just maybe the obvious, needing stormwater management standards upgraded with policy. Maybe that's, the obvious one. Just looking at how to deal with stormwater and natural resources maybe together, and we talked a lot about development and how that relates back in with development, and maybe doing development a little bit differently and better. Perhaps, buying the floodplain and the water passage areas ahead of development, or laying out a plan for that. Then we started talking about planning and how a regional planning organization, because we don't want to do it just within our own boundaries, but being able to get it at a bigger scale, and what problems that brings with getting something like that. And maybe the WMA is our best bet right now to move forward with that kind of planning, whether it be for looking at the stream buffers or the floodplain type areas. We did also mention just kind of the really nitty-gritty details of having maybe better enforcement during construction because of some of the problems that brings about, having more teeth in it, even to get more compliance with it. I think that was the main things. Anything else? All right.
Great job. Again, everybody, big round of applause for yourselves. Good job. I would like to get the recorder's sheets so that we'll be able to do some kind of summary of this discussion. And we've got other pieces of the discussion we never got a chance to have, so hopefully we can do more with that next time. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer and Aaron to talk about next time. August 22nd.
Yeah, great. Yeah, the next session is going to be on August 22nd, so it's going to come right up fast, and it will tie really nicely with some of the stuff we've been talking about today, because that's where we're really going to get into the development scenarios. The private land, the public land. We're going to hear from a developer from Minnesota that's been working for many, many years on some of these new approaches, and that it's working and they're still making some money. We're also going to hear from local developers and a couple cities on like stormwater management plans and some of the ways they're moving forward to try and make things work better. So I think it will all tie together nicely on what are some of the next steps we can do within development and how we develop our communities and how stormwater plays a role in it. So hopefully everyone can make it back here on the 22nd for that session. Is there any more announcements?
I don't know that I can add too much. Just be watching your emails for communications that come out. Please be inviting anybody else in staff, elected officials. It was great to have Mary Andewig here today. And then I'm going to do a public service announcement reminder. October the 2nd, I believe it is the Green Infrastructure Conference. That would be a really great opportunity to have elected officials come hear some of the things that you've been hearing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That day we have what we call a breakfast session that's going to be from 7:30 to 9. That would be targeted towards those officials so that they don't have to spend the whole day, but there's a whole day planned, and I've seen the nearly final draft, and it should be out very soon for the event that's going to be at the FFA Center on the DMAC campus. So there's going to be some good speakers from across the country talking about what could potentially be some of our next steps. So that's definitely one to make sure you have on your calendar.
And also there is a session for that conference that is focused on this process that you've all been a part of and lessons learned. So if there are particular items that you want to make sure get highlighted, please let us know.
Yeah, good point. All right, did we make it? Oh yeah, it's 4:01, but Pat was done by 4, so thanks everyone for coming. It was a good day.